Hello and welcome to a brand new series of videos from me, Ben at All Sociology, focusing this time on A-Level Sociology. We've done GCSE Sociology, we've completed that one, mate. We're now on to A-Level Sociology. I get loads and loads of comments. Can you please do some videos on A-Level Sociology? Let's give the people hopefully what they want. And we're going to start today by looking at the education topic, and specifically we're going to focus on achievement. So I'm going to share my screen with you, and what you should be able to see in a moment is me in my little perch up there. And then on the screen, you should be able to see the agenda for what I'm going to run through with you today. So this is a big topic, and we're going to start really by looking at achievement by different social groups. And specifically, we're talking here about social class, gender, and ethnicity as well. So I'm going to run through those things with you today. I'm going to try and keep this video fairly short, hopefully 20, 25 minutes or so, because what I want to do is just introduce you to what this part of the specification is, what these different things mean, if you don't already know: class, gender, ethnicity. We want to look at some of the reasons why there are differences in terms of achievement and really what achievement means between these social groups. And we'll finish off by looking at an exam question. Now, the idea with this is that I'm going to put a few more videos out very shortly. One is going to look specifically at social class, one is going to look specifically at ethnicity, and one's going to look specifically at gender. But this video today is really to give you some introductory context to this issue of achievement in education. So without further ado, let's get into it. So we're going to run through, first of all, looking at the AQA specification. So what does the specification from the AQA say? Well, basically, it argues that you should be expected to be familiar with sociological explanations of differential educational achievement of social groups by A, social class, B, gender, and C, ethnicity in contemporary society, so the present day today. Now, what this actually means for you is that achievement can be written about and spoken about as something as well called attainment. Effectively, they mean the same thing. What we're really talking about this is about how well certain students do at school and why there are differences between different groups of students. Now, there's lots of different ways to measure this. One way would be looking at something we call attainment A. Another way is progress A. Those measures are slightly complicated, and they can also be a little bit problematic as well. So what we're going to instead sort of just keep it simple, and we're going to focus on things about like getting a bunch of good GCSEs, and ostensibly we tend to include English and maths in that set of good GCSEs. So we might be thinking here about how many students from different social groups get 5 or more A star to C or 9 to 5 GCSEs in any given year. Now, as we will go through today, we want to be talking about the differences between social classes, ethnicities, and genders as well. But really, what I don't want people to get confused about is the differences really between state schools and independent schools, so private schools and public schools. Really, what the AQA wants us to focus on is the differences between pupils within state schools. So go into like academies or comprehensive schools, those kind of things. So that's what we're going to do today. Now, let's have a look at really what these different things mean. We've got social class, ethnicity, and gender. What do those things mean? We'll start off with social class. Social class is basically measured on what we call your socioeconomic background, which is ultimately about the amount of money that you have coming in to your household. So really about really how much money your parents earn and what kind of job they do. It is not, however, only about what we call material or economic wealth. It is also about other things as well, which we'll look at more in the next video as we go through. So it's measured really by looking at how much money is brought into the household, but ultimately it's about something broader than just material and economic assets. Now, why is class important? Class has the biggest impact on how likely a student is to do at GCSE. So this is going to be the basis of my next video, and probably quite a long video at that as well, because there's an awful lot to say about it. So what do we mean when we talk about class? Well, ultimately, we're looking at differences between two social groups. We're looking at working class students, who I'm going to refer to often as WC, or write it as WC just because it's shorter, and middle class students. So ostensibly, the difference between those two is working class students tend to be of a lower income background. Middle class students tend to be of a higher income background, rich and poor, if you want to use those words. But ultimately, we're going to talk about them in terms of working class and middle class. What about ethnicity? Ethnicity is really about someone's cultural background or their heritage. It can include things like someone's nationality, the language they speak, the religion they have, customs they have, as well as their race. So their physical features, predominantly kind of what color skin somebody has as well. But it's not just about skin color. That's race. Ethnicity is a broader category. Why are we going to focus on ethnicity? Well, obviously because the exam board want you to look at that, but there is really, really important thing to say that someone's social class is heavily influenced and heavily affected by someone's ethnicity. Really shortly, if you are an ethnic minority or black minority ethnic, you tend to be of a lower income, you tend to be more likely to be working class, and we'll go through a lot of those issues in the third video in this series. Now, why do we look at social class? Why do we look at ethnicity? Because there are huge differences between the highest and lowest achieving ethnic groups, and we'll look at those more in a future video. So what do we mean? What kind of groups are we talking about here? Things like, but not limited to, white British, Black Caribbean, Black African, mixed ethnic heritage, Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi. There's loads of different ethnic groups, which gives you loads of different types of people, types of students to be able to talk about as to why certain of those groups achieve better than others. And then finally, on to gender. What do we mean by gender? Ultimately, it's the characteristics you display in terms of the norms and values we associate with being either male or female, so boy or girl. It's the same as sex, but gender is more of a performative thing. But ultimately, we're talking about males and females, boys and girls here. Now, again, there are huge differences between girls and boys in terms of achievement at secondary school, and really in all the educational sector, but ultimately girls tend to achieve much higher than boys across a range of different metrics and measures. So we'll look into that in a bit more detail in the fourth video in this series. So ultimately, I think the key thing to get across here is just think about boys and girls and the differences between boys and girls. You don't need to concern yourself or worry about anything to do with transgender students. Not to say that's not important, but it's not something that the AQA at A-Level want you to be able to necessarily go into any detail on. So just to keep things as simple as possible, we're just going to focus on the differences between boys and girls. So let's hopefully, we've thrashed out some of the key things we mean by those categories. What we're going to do now is have a look at some of the key patterns and trends that affect working class and middle class, different ethnic groups, and then also gender as well. So let's start by looking at the key patterns and trends in terms of social class. Well, I suppose that the best way to sort of think about this is by looking at pupils who are on free school meals. And if you are eligible for free school meals, it tends to be pupils from the lower socioeconomic background, so lower working class students. And the differences in terms of students who get free school meals versus those who don't get have remained pretty consistent over time since free school meals have been introduced in the last sort of 20 years or so. It's a really good measure for us to look at the differences between the lower working class students and ultimately everybody else. So if we bring up a couple of pie charts here, really simple pie charts, just looking at some data from 2023. In 2023, 43% of pupils on free school meals achieved good GCSEs in English and maths, but 57% did not. So we're looking at less than half of all students who are eligible for free school meals actually end up getting those good GCSEs in English and maths. Now, if we compare that data to pupils who don't get free school meals, so everybody else from a more affluent background, even those from within the working class, we can see there it's nearly 3/4 of pupils who don't get or aren't eligible for free school meals who are getting the same good GCSEs in English and maths. So you've got a real big 40-odd% difference there between the lower income pupils who are getting free school meals and those pupils who basically everybody else. Okay. Now, there is lots of data about this online. Please go and have a look at it. But I do want to just kind of try and keep it simple here to introduce you to some of the frank and the quite staggering statistics around class, specifically looking at free school meals and those pupils not on free school meals. So hopefully that makes a bit of sense to you, showing you the kind of context for what we're talking about here. Let's have a look at ethnicity. Now, with ethnicity, there are way more groups than just middle class and working class, or free school meal students and non-free school meal students. So I've just selectively picked a bunch here just to illustrate some of the differences between different ethnic groups. Now, again, what we're going to be looking at here is the likelihood of different ethnic groups getting a 5 or above in English and maths. And these statistics, I've taken these from 2024. These do remain fairly consistent over time as well. So it's not like I've just plucked stuff out from last year or 2024 and going, oh, look at this. This would be broadly indicative and similar across the last sort of bunch of years, 20, 30 years or so. So these should be quite illustrative for you. So let's take a look at the graph here. So I've got a nice bar graph. This is as sort of statsy and as mathsy and graphy as I get, really. But ultimately, hopefully what you can see here is that there is a staggering difference in terms of the students who are most likely to get a 5 or above in English and maths, i.e. looking at Chinese students on 78% likelihood and Indian students on 70% likelihood, going down as we move through the chart here onto 43% for white British students, 32% for Black Caribbean students, and just 8% for Gypsy and Roma students there. So we can see that there is a huge difference in the likelihood or statistical likelihood of students from different ethnic backgrounds, how likely they are to get a 5 or more at GCSE maths and English as well. So real big differences there. And again, there are loads of statistics out there. I'll put some links into the description for this video if you want to go and have a look for yourself. I've also put the source down there for this particular chart, but it's a very, very big difference between the highest achieving ethnic groups, specifically Chinese and Indian pupils, versus the lower achieving ethnic groups, specifically looking here at that 8% of Roma, Gypsy, but also other social ethnic groups as well. So what about gender? Let's go back to the pie charts and keep it simple again. Again, I'm just here going to be looking at what we call the gender achievement gap. So the differences in likelihood of boys or girls achieving versus one another. And basically, there is what we call an achievement gap of about 7%. I think it's 6.7% to be specific, but about 7% between girls and boys. What that shows us ultimately is that girls are far more likely to get quote unquote good GCSEs than boys. It's not a massive difference as we saw between, for instance, the free school meal students and non-free school meal students or the ethnic groups, but it is still a difference. And what's interesting about this is that this hasn't always been the case. This has only really been a trend we've seen over the last sort of 35, 40 years since the 1990s. And that's something I'm going to talk to you a lot more about in my video on gender, which I think will be the 4th one in this series. So let's take a look at some of these pie charts. So just looking at 2024's data here, 74%, so you know, 3/4 of girls GCSEs were a grade 4 or above, 26% weren't. When we look at boys, it's 67% of boys' GCSE grades were a 4 or above, or about a third of them were below a 4. So again, we're not looking at a massive difference, but it is statistically a significant difference. And if you think about all of the students who take GCSEs every single year, that's 6.7% or 7%. That attainment gap, that difference between girls and boys, equates to a huge amount of students. So in the forthcoming video, I'll explain to you a little bit about why we've got this difference and what sort of explanations we can use to explain it. So hopefully that's given you a bit of an overview as to what the big kind of differences are between different social classes, different ethnic groups, and also genders. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to run through some of the key concepts that explain why there are differences between these groups. Now, I'm going to go into an awful lot more detail in these that are specifically going to look at class, ethnicity and gender. So please check out those videos. They'll be coming out very soon if they're not already. But what we're going to do here is just start to really look at a very basic way that we can start to explain why there are these differences between these groups in terms of educational achievement. Now, you will probably be fairly familiar with this, and hopefully you are, because this is only supposed to be a revision video, but ultimately there are two ways that we can explain the differences between different social groups in terms of achievement. One of them is talking about what we call external factors, or factors that happen outside of school, so whether that be at home, in wider society. And we split these external factors between two different types. We're going to look at what we call material factors, which are essentially how much money you've got and the things that money can buy that might be able to help you with your education. But also we're going to look at cultural factors as well. And cultural factors are a little bit more harder to get your head around. They're basically things that you can't touch. They might include things like your family's or parental values, the attitudes you might have towards education, the language and the type of language you speak, and also the ways in which you're socialized and brought up as well. All of these things can have an impact on why we see some of those differences that we looked at with those charts and graphs a moment ago. Now, the other way we need to talk about, and whenever you get a question, and we'll have a look at the question in a minute, on differences between education and achievement, you're going to need to look at both stuff that goes on outside of school, so our external factors, but we're also going to need to think about things that go on inside of school as well. So these are what we refer to, what I will refer to as internal factors. And they can include a whole bunch of different things. Now, it might well be the relationships that we have between pupils and teachers at school that might link to things like labeling, self-fulfilling prophecies, halo effects, those kind of things. We can also think about the ways that schools organize their teaching and learning. So whether that's things like setting or banding and streaming, those kind of things can have a huge effect as well. Subcultural responses, specifically in relation to the experience of schooling, or perhaps the relationships or the treatment that students are given by particular teachers or by their school. So we'll look at some of those in terms of class, ethnicity, and gender. Pupil identities as well is a huge thing as well, and often we talk about there being a bit of a clash between working class identities and the middle class habitus or middle class nature or culture of school as well. So that can play a role in this, and hopefully as I'm going through these, some of these hopefully will be ringing a bell with your revision. But also there's stuff also that goes on specifically within schools that aren't really anything to do with pupils per se, but have a huge effect on their likelihood of achievement. So whether it be the formal curriculum, so the actual lessons and subjects and topics that are taught within the curriculum, like on the national curriculum, or whether it be those things that are a little bit more hidden away. So for instance, the ethos and the values of a school through the hidden curriculum as well. So there's a whole different bunch of explanations, but ultimately, if you ever get a question about why certain groups achieve better than others, you want to be talking about different types of factors, both internal factors on this hand and then external factors on that hand as well. Now, I will go into a lot more detail with this with you as I go through those other videos, because there is a huge amount of stuff to say. This is just supposed to be an overview at the moment. But what is very important to say is that those factors, those external and internal factors, they are not independent of one another. They do influence each other, particularly what goes on at home can influence how you might behave or how you might be treated within school. That's a key thing to bear in mind. The other thing to bear in mind is that even though I'm going to go through different types of students, so social class, ethnicity, and gender, those things also intersect and overlap with one another as well. So things that might affect boys or girls, that might have a greater or lesser effect according to whether you are of an ethnic minority or whether you are working class, for instance, or middle class. So those things kind of link in and touch one another as well. But just to say as well that you don't, if you get a question or you get asked about gender, you don't really need to make a distinction between material and cultural factors that go on outside of school, ultimately because those kind of factors are going to affect boys and girls broadly in the same way. What you will need to do with gender, though, is to think about the differences between girls' achievement, perhaps boys' underachievement, but also about how those patterns of achievement have changed, as I say, over the last sort of 35 years since the late 80s, start of the 1990s. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an overview. Hopefully you are familiar with some of those things that I'm talking about and you're using this as a revision video, this isn't supposed to be anything that goes into any great depth or anything like that, but hopefully those things do ring a bell for you. If not in those particular terms, you will understand, for instance, with pupil-teacher relationships, hopefully you know a little bit about labeling. With subcultures, you might know a little bit about anti-school subcultures and those kind of things. So that brings us ultimately to having a quick look. I'm not going to spend ages on this, a quick look at a typical exam question. So the education topic will be on A-Level Paper 1, which will be the first A-Level paper that you sit. This one, I've taken this from 2023. And the reason I've taken this particular question is because it asks you to apply, as they always will do, there'll always be 30-mark questions that ask you to apply material from the item or the source and your own knowledge. Evaluate the importance of cultural factors in explaining patterns of educational achievement. So let's have a look at the item and read what it says. The item reads, there are differences in patterns of educational achievement between groups of pupils. These differences can be based on class, gender, or ethnicity, or a combination of these. Some sociologists argue that cultural factors are the main explanation for differences in educational achievement. Differences in primary socialization may mean that some groups find it easier to engage with the culture of the school. However, other sociologists argue that material factors, such as access to resources, are also important. So this question is very, very broad. First of all, you can write about class, gender, or ethnicity. But in the item, we're going to pick out a couple of things here. So there's your class, gender, ethnicity, or as I mentioned a moment ago, a combination of those factors as well, such as thinking about working class boys or middle class girls from a Chinese background or whatever it might be. So those things can overlap with one another as well as being three distinct entities as well. In the item as well, we've got a couple of comments here. So it reads, some sociologists argue that cultural factors and the main explanations for differences in educational achievement. So one of the things hopefully you would write about in this type of question would be something to do with cultural factors, whether that be values or socialization or cultural capital or something like that. But you've also got in the final paragraph or the final sentence there, other sociologists argue that material factors such as access to resources are also important. So you've got a few kind of what we call hooks or clues in the item for you there. Hopefully that links into some of the stuff that you know already and that I briefly mentioned earlier in terms of that very basic internal, external, and external cultural and material kind of matrix about how we might answer one of these questions. This would be, as I say, a 30-mark question, even though it doesn't mention anywhere in the item anything about internal in-school factors. That does not mean you shouldn't be talking about it or writing about it, because it does say using item B and your own knowledge. Evaluate the importance of those cultural factors. So you want to be talking about cultural factors for sure, but you're also going to be mentioning hopefully about material factors as well as stuff that goes on inside school as well. So hopefully that gives you an idea. And just for reference, in the future videos I'm going to run through with you, I'll run through some other essay past paper questions, as well as giving you some ideas about how you answer them. But just very briefly, in order to answer one of these, if you're looking at the top end of the mark scheme, so to really hit high 20s, if not 30 out of 30, the basic format you want to be looking at for this is a short introduction. You want ideally about 6 paragraphs, and you want to split those between external cultural, external material, and internal factors, and then a conclusion as well. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea of the sort of thing that you might come up against in your exam, although that is one from 2023. So to pull everything together, to sort of wrap up and just go over what we've gone through this day, today, in this video, whatever you want to say it. What I've done, hopefully, is I've gone through with you with the AQA A-Level Specification. We've looked at what achievement means, the fact that there's a variety of different ways you can measure it. And we've also talked about the fact that ultimately you want to be talking about the differences between pupils within state schools. We've considered what class, gender, and ethnicity mean. And we've also looked at some key categories of those. For example, looking at with class, pupils on free school meals versus pupils not on free school meals, girls and boys, and also different ethnic groups. We considered some of the key patterns and trends by looking at those pie charts and bar graphs as well, and we can see that middle class perform better than working class pupils, or students on free school meals at the lower end of that working class scale don't do as well as kids who don't get free school meals, excuse me. We know that some black minority ethnic groups perform much better than others, namely Indian and Chinese. And we also know that there's an achievement gap of about 7% between girls and boys, so girls outperforming boys there. We then finished up really by looking at some key concepts and explanations, looking at the differences between external factors, cultural and material, as well as internal factors. And we finished off by looking at an exam question as well. So hopefully that's given you a broad overview as to what we have been doing today. And hopefully that's given you a bit of a reminder or a refresher of why some of these things are important. I'm going to get rid of this screen now. I'm going to come back just very briefly with you just to say thank you very much for watching. As I mentioned, there is going to be quite a few more videos of this nature coming out. The next one is going to be based on social class. So give that one a watch. That will really go over some of the key issues with those external and internal factors. Then I'm going to do one on ethnicity, and then you've got one coming up on gender as well. So I hope those are helpful for you. If you have found this video helpful, do us a favor, put a like on it, tell your friends about it who also do sociology. That would mean the absolute world to me. If you've got any questions, pop them in the comments. I'll endeavor to get back to you as soon as I can. But otherwise, I'm going to sign off. Thank you very much for watching and have a great day. Speak to you soon. Bye.